The ocean doesn't just want to drown you. It wants to crush the memory of you from the earth. My name is Julian Vane, and for 15 years, I've lived in the squeezes. I am a saturation diver. Most people think of diving as coral reefs and colorful fish. For me, it's a pressurized steel coffin, breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen that turns your voice into a cartoonish squeak, while the cold nitrogen seeps into your bones like liquid lead. I've spent more time at 300 meters than I have with my own daughter. Maybe that's why my wife left. Or maybe it's because when I do come home, I smell like ozone and wet iron, and I stare at the walls as if I'm waiting for them to buckle under the weight of several billion tons of seawater. The job was supposed to be a standard salvage. The SS Verity, a research vessel owned by a conglomerate that didn't like answering questions, had gone down in the Philippine Trench. They told me it was a mechanical failure. They told me there were sensitive hard drives to recover. But as the diving bell lowered into the absolute black of the Hadal Zone, the depth gauge on my wrist didn't stop where it was supposed to. 400 meters, 500, 600. Control, this is Vane, I said, my voice high-pitched from the heliox. We're past the Verity's last known coordinates. The pressure is spiking. Are you reading this? Static. Then, a voice that sounded like it was being filtered through a meat grinder. Proceed, Julian. The prize is deeper. The structure is waiting. Structure? They said it was a ship. The bell shuddered. Outside the thick acrylic porthole, the bioluminescent creatures of the deep nightmare things with translucent skin and needle teeth fled as if something much larger was approaching. Then the lights of the bell hit it. It wasn't a ship. It was a spire, a jagged, obsidian needle that seemed to grow out of the ocean floor, reaching upward like a frozen scream. It was covered in carvings that looked less like art and more like a mathematical language designed to induce migraines. Julian, the voice came again. Exit the bell. Enter the airlock at the base. You have 90 minutes of life support. I didn't want to go. Every instinct I had, honed by a decade of survival, told me that if I stepped out of that bell, I would be stepping out of the world of the living. But the contract was signed in blood and debt. If I didn't go, my family would never see a cent of the insurance. I pressurized my suit. The suit is a masterpiece of engineering, a hard suit designed to withstand the crushing weight that would turn a human body into a red paste in a microsecond. I stepped out into the void. The silence of the deep is not quiet. It's a physical presence. It presses against your ears, a low-frequency hum that vibrates in your molars. I walked along the seabed, my boots kicking up silt that hadn't been disturbed since the dawn of man. As I approached the spire, the carvings began to glow, not with light, but with a color that shouldn't exist, a bruised purple that made my eyes water. I reached the airlock. It wasn't steel. It looked like bone, porous, white, and cold. As I touched it, the door didn't slide. It dissolved. I'm inside, I whispered. Good, Control replied. There was a sound in the background. Laughing? No, it was the sound of someone weeping. The transition has begun. The airlock sealed behind me. The water drained, replaced by an atmosphere that smelled of old libraries and wet copper. I cracked my helmet. The air was thick, heavy, but breathable. I stepped into a hallway that stretched further than the width of the spire should have allowed. That was the first retention loop. The geometry was wrong. I walked for 10 minutes in a straight line, but when I turned around, the airlock was only 5 feet behind me. When I looked again, it was gone. I wasn't in a shipwreck. I was in a digestive system. I found a room filled with water, but the water was floating in the center of the air, a perfect sphere of liquid. Inside the sphere, I saw my daughter, Clara. She was 6 years old again, blowing bubbles in a backyard pool. I reached out to touch the sphere, and the water turned into oil. The memory distorted. Clara's face elongated, her eyes becoming the black, empty pits of the deep-sea fish I'd seen outside. Julian. Her voice came from the walls. Why did you leave us in the dark? I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. My suit's vitals monitor began to chirp high blood pressure, elevated CO2. I tried to close my eyes, but the images were burned into my retinas. This place, this structure, was feeding on my guilt. I pushed deeper into the spire. The architecture changed from bone to something resembling rusted machinery. Piston-like growths pulsed in the ceiling, dripping a thick, black ichor that hissed when it hit the floor. I found the hard drives the company wanted. They weren't electronics. They were jars, hundreds of them, filled with a gray, pulsating matter. I picked one up. The label on the jar didn't have a serial number. It had a name, Diver 712 Marcus Thorne. Marcus had been my mentor. He disappeared on a job in the North Sea 5 years ago. They told us it was a total loss, a hull breach. But here he was, or at least the part of him that mattered, sitting in a jar at the bottom of the world. Control. What is this place? I screamed into the comms. It's a library, Julian, the voice responded. It sounded closer now, as if the person was standing right behind my ear. The deep doesn't destroy, preserves. You are here to donate. I realized then that the last diver wasn't a title of honor. It was a description of a final harvest. The company wasn't a salvage firm. They were harvesters for something ancient that lived beneath the crust. Something that needed human consciousness to understand the surface world it intended to consume. I ran. I didn't care about the suit or the pressure. I ran back toward where I thought the airlock was, but the hallway began to twist. The floor became soft, like a tongue. The walls began to bleed the bruised purple light. I encountered a version of myself standing in a doorway. It wasn't a reflection. It was a physical entity, wearing my diving suit, but its face was a smooth, featureless surface of obsidian. It pointed at me, and I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest. "You're already dead, Julian," the double said in my own voice. "You died the moment you signed the contract. This is just the filing process." I drew my dive knife, a heavy tungsten blade, and lunged. The blade passed through the entity as if it were smoke. I fell through the doorway and found myself in a chamber that looked exactly like my living room back in Bristol. The television was on, playing static. The smell of my wife's perfume was overwhelming. But when I looked out the window, there was no street, only the crushing, infinite black of the ocean, and the glowing eyes of things that have been waiting for the sun to go out. I sat on the sofa, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at the coffee table. There was a jar. It was empty. The label read, Julian Vane. The final hour of my life began when I realized I couldn't feel my legs. I looked down. My legs weren't gone. They were becoming part of the floor. The white, bone-like material was growing up over my suit, fusing me to the structure. I wasn't being killed. I was being integrated. "Julian," the voice of control said, but this time it came from the television in my simulated living room. "The process is almost complete. Your memories of the surface, the smell of rain, the warmth of your daughter's hand, they are being uploaded. They are the coordinates we need." "Coordinates for what?" I rasped. "For the return. We have been trapped in the dark for eons. We needed a bridge, a mind that knew the way back to the light. You were the perfect candidate. So much regret, so much to cling to." I felt my mind beginning to fray. I saw my life as a series of snapshots, being pulled out of my head like threads from a sweater. I saw my wedding day, the birth of Clara, the first time I went underwater. Each memory felt like a physical loss, leaving a cold, numb hole in its wake. But in that darkness, I found a spark of spite. If they wanted my mind to use as a map, I would give them a map to nowhere. I focused on the squeezes. I focused on the feeling of nitrogen narcosis, the rapture of the deep that makes divers see hallucinations and lose their sense of direction. I flooded my thoughts with the image of a compass spinning wildly, of a world where there is no up or down, only the crushing weight. The structure groaned. The walls of the living room began to crack. The black ichor sprayed from the ceiling. "What are you doing?" Control screamed. The voice was no longer human. It was a screech of grinding tectonic plates. "Give us the way." "You want the deep?" I whispered, my vision fading to black. "Then stay in it. I took my dive knife and did the one thing a diver is never supposed to do. I punctured my own suit's oxygen line and jammed the knife into the pressure regulator. The pressure didn't kill me instantly. The structure tried to hold me together, to keep my brain alive long enough to finish the harvest. I felt my body being pulled in two directions, the ocean wanting to crush me, and the spire wanting to preserve me. Then came the twist. As my consciousness drifted, I saw through the eyes of the entity that had been wearing my face. It wasn't in the spire. It was on the surface. It was standing in my kitchen in Bristol. My daughter, Clara, was running toward it, shouting, "Daddy, you're home." The entity reached out with hands that looked like mine but felt like cold stone. It smiled with my mouth. The harvest wasn't just taking my memories. It was an exchange. I was becoming the spire, the literal foundation of their prison, and they were sending me back to the surface. But it wasn't me. It was a Trojan horse. Every memory they took from me was a blueprint for how to mimic a human, how to infiltrate a home, how to start the harvest on land. I am the spire now. I am the bone and the black ichor. I am the silence of the Philippine Trench. I can feel every gallon of water pressing down on me. I am immortal and I am in agony. And on the surface, myself is tucking my daughter into bed. It is looking at the moon and calculating how much water is stored in the atmosphere, waiting to be unleashed. The ocean has 1,000 ways to kill you, but the worst way is letting you think you escaped. I am Julian Vane. I am the last diver, and I am the reason the world is about to drown.